The Denver Broncos have added a pass rusher opposite of Bradley Chubb, and it is a move that possesses a little bit of high risk, high reward here for the Denver Broncos. However, could they be done at making moves at edge rusher? Both Sayre, Bedinger, and myself dive into this big-time breakdown here for the Denver Broncos' latest free agency signing on today's brand new episode, Locked on Broncos.
You are Locked on Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked on Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, Broncos country? Welcome back into a brand new episode of Locked on Broncos. This is a breaking news podcast as the Denver Broncos have agreed to terms with former Dallas Cowboys pass rusher Randy Gregory. What does this mean for the Denver Broncos? We're going to dive into what the impact of this move does for the organization here in 2022. From the South Stands to the End Zone, I'm your host, as always, Cody Roark, joined alongside by my co-host, Sayre Bedinger. Both of us, we cover the Denver Broncos for the Locked On Network and 9 News. Thank you once again for making Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day. You can get this podcast free and available everywhere you get your podcast in audio format. You can also watch us here on YouTube. Sayre, the Broncos make a little bit of a big splash on the second day of the NFL legal tampering period here, getting Randy Gregory to flip from agreeing to terms initially with the Dallas Cowboys on a long-term extension and flipping it to the Denver Broncos. A little bit of a surprise here. And look, I think rightfully so, Broncos country kind of skeptical on it, but this is why we're here. We're going to process it all right here, right now.
How about that, man? I mean, the Dallas Cowboys even tweeted out that they had reached an agreement with Randy Gregory. So it sounds like from all the details that are emerging on Twitter as this is all kind of just happening, it sounds like the Dallas Cowboys had agreed to a 5-year deal, $70 million with Randy Gregory to bring him back into the fold. At the last second, they must have started trying to change some of the verbiage in the contract or some of the terms of the contract. And Gregory was like, look, I've got the same offer on the table from the Denver Broncos. If you guys want to change it, I'm out. And he left. So to me, I mean, this is fascinating, Cody. We've heard from Ed Werder on Twitter that Gregory was the Broncos' #1 pass rusher, even over Chandler Jones. And of course, that would mean he would be #1 over Von Miller as well on their offseason pass rusher priority list. And this was a top need. I went back looking at some of our older episodes too, talking about, people were asking us back in December of 2021, what are the Broncos going to focus on in the offseason? And then the #1 thing that you and I both agreed on, Cody, was working from the outside in on that defensive front, going from the edge to the interior defensive line. Now you got Randy Gregory joining DJ Jones on that defensive front 7, and the Broncos are making some waves there. So Broncos country is not thrilled about the move, but it's the move. So what do we do from here?
we talk about it too. And look, and here's the deal. I think as well, I think a lot of Broncos fans are surprised initially because, I think rightfully so, we were all looking at maybe some bigger name options, right? We were talking about the Chandler Joneses, maybe the return of Von Miller here. And I think the question that many people have, like I even put out on Twitter too, instant reaction that, unless the Broncos sign another edge rusher, I don't know if I'm a big time fan of this move as the sole move at outside linebacker. And this has nothing to do with Randy Gregory at all as a football player. I'd say my main concerns about this, Sayre, really stem from the fact that throughout his entire career in the NFL, he has yet to finish a full season in its entirety. And, part of that was due to the suspension he had early on in his career. He's done a lot of growing and a lot of maturing along the way. That's one thing that Jerry Jones really impacted, and it was a big part as to why Randy Gregory decided initially this morning that he was going to stay in Dallas. And then once they started getting further into the contracts to finalize it, apparently the Dallas Cowboys, as you mentioned, wanted to change some stuff. And Gregory was like, nah, that's not good. And so obviously the Broncos now welcoming him in as the pass rusher. And I just think our concerns, and we touched on it yesterday when we talked about the Broncos rumor mill, so a lot of it was, okay, hey, Bradley Chubb has had some durability concerns. So has Randy Gregory. And I think really that's just my main concern. I think that's why it's a high risk, high reward potential move here for the Broncos organization. Now, I think the question we have to ask here, Sayre, was this the right move in your opinion for the Broncos? Like I said, I feel like you and I have both kind of weighed the pros and cons as to maybe why it was a good move, maybe why it was not a good move, but I want your thoughts a little bit more on this. And also, looking at his impact, in 12 games last season in 2021, he had 29 pressures. That is a super high pressure rate for a guy only played in 12 games. That right there is ridiculous. So he does have the pass rush impact, value, and potential that the Broncos do need.
He does. He does bring that to the table. And one thing that I think I always look for this too, Cody, when Broncos sign somebody that, I haven't done a ton of film study on, or somebody that I haven't done a ton of background research on, I always like to look and see what the team, the fans of the team that he's currently with are saying, or the analysts and experts of the team that they previously, I guess, at this point with are saying. And it seems unanimous. So Dallas Cowboys Twitter, they are all very, very upset to see Randy Gregory leaving. Like you mentioned, 29 pressures in 12 games, in addition to the 6 sacks, in addition to 17 QB hits, in addition to 3 forced fumbles. He's definitely capable of getting after the quarterback. And I saw a tweet from James Palmer that said he had 5 plays that resulted in a turnover, 5 pass rushes that resulted in a turnover last season, which was tied for the most in the NFL. So obviously there's productivity there. Obviously there's stuff there that's just beyond the sack numbers. You look at the sack numbers and you're like, well, I mean, somebody could accidentally get 6 sacks, right? I mean, Chandler Jones had 5 sacks in one game last season. So I get why people are kind of frazzled about that. But at the same time, on paper, this deal is 5 years, 70 million, right? But really 28 million guarantees. That's not even half the contract guaranteed, Cody. So I think what we can look at with that is that it's essentially a 2-year pact and then kind of wait and see mode at that point.
I think that provides a little bit of relief here to Broncos country. And, I think we also have to ask the question, are the Broncos done at edge rusher? Could they make some more moves here, Sayre? That's a question we're going to ponder coming up here in just a moment. But real quick on this breaking news podcast, let me tell you about the sponsor of today's episode of the show. It's our good friends over there at Built Bar. And as you know it, Broncos country, Built Bar is the best tasting protein bar that is out there on the market today. The bars, they are healthy. They're 100% filled with milk chocolate too, which is a ridiculous value there. But let me tell you a little bit more about why I love Built Bar. Not only is it the best tasting protein bar on the market, it's also the healthiest for you as well. Each bar contains 17 grams of protein, 130 calories, and only 4 grams of sugar. And they have 9 amazing original flavors. Plus, they have the occasional limited time flavor, including the puffs, the churro puffs being my favorite. I love the peanut butter brownie flavor. Sayre, I know you love the puff flavors as well. And we encourage Broncos country to get their hands on a box of Built Bar today by going to built.com. And when you go to checkout, make sure you use promo code LOCK15, and then I'll get you 15% off your next order at built.com. Continuing our reaction here on the Denver Broncos move of acquiring Randy Gregory, agreeing to terms initially on a 5-year deal. A lot of different mixed reaction from Broncos country, but this Locked On Broncos podcast is here to provide a little bit of clarity on both sides. We're going to weigh the pros and cons of this move, but diving a little bit deeper into our conversation, Sayre, one of the things I put out in terms of unless the Broncos sign another edge rusher, I'm not sure if I'm a big fan of this move. Denver could still add another edge rusher because here, think about it this way. You do have Bradley Chubb, as we talked about. Some of the concerns about durability, it's a big year for him contract-wise. Now you bring in Randy Gregory, similar durability issues in terms of him, the fact that he's never finished a full season in the NFL. Both these guys have ridiculous amounts of talent and potential to them at edge rusher. I don't want to understate that. But then behind them, yes, you have Jonathan Cooper in a rotational role, but the Broncos, at the time of this recording, Sayre, they have yet to make a decision on Malik Reed, who's obviously an undrafted rookie free agent, has been an impact player for them. They have some other guys too, Andre Mintz on the practice squad from last season. Edge rusher still, I think you need a little bit more depth there, maybe a little bit of a bigger name as well. I don't know necessarily if you want to go and get a big name here, but I think another impact player at that position, because how often have we seen, Sayre, when the Broncos lose an edge rusher due to injury, they lack in that production of getting to the quarterback. So you need to have solidified depth here. Our hope is that this is one of 2 potential moves at edge rusher for the Broncos. Now the question is, Sayre, who is still available at the time we're doing this breaking news podcast that maybe the Broncos can go out and get?
Well, I mean, at the time we're recording this, it feels like everybody is still available, right? Von Miller, Chandler Jones. Then you've got guys like Zadarius Smith, who was cut by the Green Bay Packers. And you've still got other players out there like Jadeveon Clowney, Justin Houston, veteran guys, maybe some reclamation project like Dante Fowler Jr., who was cut by the Atlanta Falcons as well, and has some history with some of the coaches, at least. I don't know how well they know him from Jacksonville, but some of the guys that were in Jacksonville probably know Dante Fowler a little bit. So I agree with you completely on this, Cody. My stance hasn't changed. I think a lot of people will come out and just be like, the Broncos made the move, so now I kind of love it. I'm still in the same exact spot that I was last night, where it's not that I'm wishing that they had not got him, but I still believe firmly you have to go and get somebody else. Bradley Chubb hasn't been able to play a full season for a couple of years. Randy Gregory also has never played a full season, like you mentioned. So the fact that those 2 guys have never really done a full season, and Bradley Chubb has one under his belt, but I mean, for all intents and purposes, you can't bank on these guys playing all 17 games. And because of that, I think you do need to go get someone that at least has starting history potential. I know George Payton is high on this year's draft, but I would be looking to free agency first here to say, maybe there's a guy like Anthony Barr that could come in and play a versatile role for you, to say, okay, you'll be an off-ball linebacker, but if anything happens to Randy Gregory or Bradley Chubb, we'll slide you over to play some edge because Anthony Barr is definitely big enough to do that. The question is how would he respond in a full-time role there? So those are some names that I'd be looking at just as an idea here going forward. I don't necessarily know that we're going to get Von Miller back at this point. I don't think I would honestly say I highly doubt that with
Yeah.
this signing, especially considering reports are coming out that Gregory was their number one guy on the pass rusher market. But never say never at NFL free agency. It just doesn't feel that likely. But I agree with you completely. You've got to go get somebody else.
Well, here's the thing too. I mean, the Broncos also entered this year's free agency with, pretty manageable salary cap. And I imagine that George Paton and the executives of this front office are probably going to approach some players to maybe restructure some deals, help convert and maybe move around some salary cap to create some additional space here. I imagine we might see that. But, hey, if the Broncos do out and they get another edge rusher, Sayre, I think then all of a sudden, okay, then we can look at this as like, hey, this is, a great move because outside of just getting one edge rusher, you got two, which means that you have a little bit more added security to the position value overall here. And here's the deal too. Look, and I want to be very upfront about this because I had some people on Twitter coming at me saying that, why are you questioning? I'm not questioning George Paton. Look, George Paton has given me zero reasons there, I think, to question him in anything that he's done so far as the GM. However, I'd say like this as the sole move, is this the sole move for the Broncos at edge rusher? I definitely think some people, and especially some Broncos fans, agree this is kind of a head scratching move in a sense, considering all things that we had just talked about. But it goes back to the notion. You have a high risk, high reward, likely outcome here with him. And look, if this is a deal that initially translates maybe to 2 years for the Broncos, and maybe after 2 years they have an out, certainly it makes sense for them to do it because my understanding is this is going to be around a $14 million AAV in terms of the annual average. So we'll see what the final details are contract-wise when it becomes official during free agency on Wednesday, 4:00 p.m. Eastern time, the start of the new league year. But I'm with you there. There's some options out there in free agency maybe you want to take a look at and just add another depth guy. I mean, there's obviously some guys that could be a backup. You don't bring in Randy Gregory to not be a starter, plain and simple. I mean, his impact as a pass rusher, as you mentioned, with the total 29 pressures in 12 games, that's something that the Broncos need on defense. I mean, Sayre, how often did we see Von Miller when he was in Denver last year, even though he won Defensive Player of the Month in September? How often do we see him double team or triple team? I will say this, though. The one thing about Randy Gregory that does stand out in terms of his film and his impact, even though people are looking at his 6 sacks that he had last year, like, oh, it's not high sack production. It's not all about sacks. And I don't know how many times we've said that here on the show. We're going to continue to harp on it. His pressure and the opportunities he created for the other guys in that defense, it stood out. His pressure on opposing quarterbacks created it to where other guys on the defensive side of the ball, whether it be on the interior or the other edge rusher, especially the Michael Parsons, it allowed them to get sacks as well. So as long as the Broncos are getting after the quarterbacks there, I don't think we'll complain about this move later on down the road if he can stay healthy and he's creating that impact. And look, if he's getting after the quarterback and getting sacks themselves, we're going to be very happy. But I think we have to look at it from both angles here. And I think that's the fair thing here that we talk about here with Broncos country. But Broncos country, we're going to dive in a little bit deeper into this move overall for the Broncos organization, some more fan feedback. Sayre, I've had some Cowboys fans texting me, tweeting me, sending me Instagram DMs that they are pissed that Randy Gregory is gone. And a couple of my former players who are Cowboys fans, they're like, you guys need to stay away from our players in Dallas. So, I mean, I guess it says a lot too that there are a lot of Dallas Cowboys analysts and a lot of Dallas Cowboys fans that have a lot to say about obviously Randy Gregory no longer being a Dallas Cowboy. They wanted to retain him. Now he is a Denver Bronco. And Sayre, I guess we can also look at it from this angle too. The Broncos have Russell Wilson. That right there, I think, maybe makes things a little bit more exciting. You can make up for a lot. And, I think deficiencies that you may have on your team, especially on defense or even on the offensive side of the ball, if you have an impact player like Russell Wilson. And maybe the Broncos aren't done just yet on the defensive side of the ball. There's some other options that maybe they will look into, George Paton. So, Sayre, like I said, I'm putting my trust in George Paton. I do have my concerns. I think they're valid, and I think that fans' concerns are also valid, and the reasons maybe why they're not as concerned are also valid as well. But coming up here in just a moment, we're going to hear from Locked On Cowboys host Marcus Mosher as he gives us a little bit inside intel on his thoughts on the Randy Gregory departure from the Dallas Cowboys and what the Denver Broncos are getting. We share our reaction and more coming up here in just a moment. But before we do that, just want to give you a special reminder. If you're a Colorado sports fan, the Locked On Podcast Network has you covered for all your Colorado professional sports. The Denver Nuggets just beat the Philadelphia 76ers in Philadelphia. Nikola Jokic triumphing over Joel Embiid. The Colorado Rockies are getting ready ready to start up their season here once again after the MLB lockout has ended. We have coverage of that. And then the Locked On Avalanche podcast. The Avs are looking to make a run at the Stanley Cup. You have the Locked On Nuggets, Locked On Rockies, and Locked On Avalanche podcast alongside your Locked On Broncos viewing pleasure every single day because we have you covered, local experts on the biggest stories here in the Locked On Podcast Network. All right, Sayre, as we get into the fourth quarter action on today's episode, Locked On Broncos Emergency Podcast, the Broncos adding in edge rusher Randy Gregory from the Dallas Cowboys. We talked about the deal. We talked about the impact that it will have on the Broncos defense if, in fact, things do pan out. And I think it's always important that we always go back to say, okay, hey, kind of what we talk about the NFL drafts here. What was one thing we've said about prospects? We look at them not as to who they are, but what they could be. And I think that, yes, I myself at times as an analyst get guilty of kind of looking too far ahead. But I do think that there are things that Randy Gregory can offer to the Broncos defense that, like I said, do provide value. And I think the concerns, as we've expressed here on the show, are definitely valid at this point in time, and we'll see what the Broncos' plan is. And I'm eager to hear from George Paton in the press conference when we get all these introductory pressers. I mean, we're going to get Randy Gregory, we're going to get DJ Jones, we're going to get the Russell Wilson presser, and Denver may not be done at that juncture as well in free agency. We're going to have you completely covered here, the Locked On Broncos podcast on your favorite podcasting provider, also on YouTube. But a major shout out to my man Marcus Mosher, one of the hosts of the Locked On Cowboys podcast. He sent over a clip for both Sayre Bedinger and myself pertaining to what the Broncos are getting at edge rusher here from Randy Gregory and maybe how he projects to fit as well. What do Cowboys fans think? What do the local experts on the Dallas Cowboys think? Here's our clip here from Marcus Mosher, host of the Locked On Cowboys podcast.
The Denver Broncos have signed former Dallas Cowboys pass rusher Randy Gregory to a 5-year, $70 million deal with $28 million guaranteed. So what type of player are the Broncos getting? They're getting one of the most athletic pass rushers in the NFL. Now, while Gregory has had some problems staying on the field, whether that be due to an injury or due to some off-the-field suspensions, Gregory is one of the most athletic, one of the most bendy pass rushers in the NFL. During the 2021 season, he was finally starting to put things together before a calf injury took away some of his season. Still, he is one of the most dynamic pass rushers in the league as he can win power, speed. He can be used on inside moves. He's really a great fit in Denver's defense. Now, he's not much of a run defender, but you're not paying him to be a run defender. You're paying him to get after the quarterback, to create pressure. And one of the best parts about Randy Gregory's game is that the athleticism is combined with a nonstop motor. He'll chase down quarterbacks. He'll fly down the field to make plays on ball carrier. He's somebody who is never going to give up on a play. It's really a great deal for both the Broncos and Randy Gregory. And despite being 29 years old, his best football is still ahead of him. Randy Gregory has the potential to be a Pro Bowl pass rusher in Denver. I can't wait to see how it plays out.
Once again, a major shout out here to Marcus Mosher for all the information on Randy Gregory. Sayre, one of the things he mentioned in that clip right there was that, he's got to continue to improve against the run. And obviously as an edge rusher, being able to play contain, especially in a 3-4 defense and not get sealed on the inside, that's going to be critical. And yes, there were some times I saw against the Dallas Cowboys where he did get sealed inside by the offensive line, which allowed Deebo Samuel, some running backs, to get to the outside. That's an area of his game that he can improve on. But he also did say you're not paying him to be a run stopper. The Broncos are paying DJ Jones, Mike Purcell, and Draymond Jones, and the linebackers to really be that run stopper. They're paying Randy Gregory to get after the quarterback. Is there anything about what he said that you agree with or disagree with?
Well, I think it's spot on, obviously, and it'd be just the same as if a Broncos free agent had signed elsewhere. I would expect the people that if we would give a blurb about a player that signed, I would expect some trust factor on that we're evaluating from a posture of obviously being positive about the guys, but also being real about where they're at. So I appreciate knowing the strengths and weaknesses, and so it's great to hear from him on that. It's great to get to know kind of what the Broncos can be expecting, and listening to that. Just talking about the run and about how important that is and how important we saw that it was for the Broncos last year. Cody, about the potential of that Bobby Wagner thing we discussed previously, that Russell Wilson is kind of recruiting him. I mean, how important is that linebacker play going to be now if your edge players aren't necessarily run defense specialists, which we don't need them to be, right? We need them to be great pass rushers, but you still have to have a strong defense. So positive vibes towards the Broncos potentially signing somebody like Wagner, at the off-ball linebacker position. But one thing that's cool too that I was reading up on Twitter, man, there was a game last season where Randy Gregory, he drew 3 holding penalties against the same offensive tackle. I think it's another factor about his pass rush abilities that doesn't get brought up. That doesn't show up as a sack on the stat sheet. But if you're drawing 3 holding penalties in one game, you're doing a lot right. You're doing a lot of things to really get into that tackle's body and to really make him uncomfortable and lose technique, lose form. So all those things put together, I feel like definitely this is a good, it's a good move from the Broncos from addressing probably the team's biggest need remaining after acquiring Russell Wilson.
Well, Broncos country, how are you feeling about the Broncos move of Randy Gregory on today's breaking news podcast here on the Locked On Broncos podcast? Will the Broncos be a little bit more active in free agency? Other moves to be made? And Sayre, there's even the possibility, what if the Broncos, upon the new league year, once it starts, obviously on Wednesday, 4 o'clock p.m. Eastern time, 2 p.m. Mountain time, what if they renegotiate? What if they extend Russell Wilson and create even more cap space? I imagine that might be something that could be in the works here for this Broncos football team to make some more moves in free agency, because not just this week when free agency happens, Sayre, there's the second wave and there's the third wave, and anything can happen at any time during those waves. And it doesn't matter if you're a big time player or a small name player, you have a chance to make a move. In the Broncos, I don't think they're done just yet, Sayre, but just in the case that they're not, well, Sayre, Bedinger, and myself will have you covered tomorrow morning for a brand new episode, Locked On Broncos, breaking down all the news possible, everything that you need, covering the team that you root for on Sundays. I'm Cody, Roark, coach of Locked On Broncos, speaking for my co-host, Sayre Bedinger. Both of us will see you tomorrow for a brand new episode, Locked On Broncos.